In the high, thin air of the Wyoming Territory, the world was made of two things: what worked, and what was about to kill you. The men of the town of Providence understood this rule. In the autumn of 1887, they were busy with the things that worked. The ring of an axe on seasoned pine, the scrape of a shovel clearing a path, the smell of hot tar sealing the gaps in a log wall. They were strengthening what they knew. They were betting their lives on the proven thickness of wood and stone. Then there was Anna. 25 years old, a widow for a year, she was not chopping more wood. She was not packing her walls with mud and horsehair. She was down at the frozen edge of the marsh, where the cattails grew thick and useless. With a small hand scythe, she was harvesting the dead, brown stalks by the armload, her dark brown ponytail a stark whip of movement against the grey sky. Her German shepherd, a formidable animal named Kaiser, sat sentinel on the bank, his breath pluming in the cold. He watched the town, then he watched her, and he did not seem to find her action strange. The town, however, did. They saw a woman alone, wrapping her cabin not in a second layer of wood, but in woven mats of swamp reed. They saw folly. They saw a funeral shroud being woven in the brittle afternoon light. And they were already whispering the name of the winter that was coming down from the north, a name spoken by the last of the trappers and the Ute who had passed through weeks before. They called it the snapper, for the way it broke the spines of trees and the wills of men. If you find value in stories of forgotten knowledge, of defiance in the face of certainty, consider subscribing. We look for the truth not in the consensus, but in the outcome. Anna worked with a rhythm that was not frantic, but deeply intentional. Each day, from sunup until the light failed, she was in the marsh. The water, not yet frozen solid, was a black, biting slush that soaked the cuffs of her long dark brown pants and numbed her feet through her worn leather boots. She would wade in, the cold a physical blow, and begin to cut. The reeds were tall, some over 6 feet, and their dry leaves whispered like secrets as she gathered them. She would bind them into large bundles with twine and haul them, one by one, back to her small cabin. The distance was only a quarter of a mile, but the weight of the damp reeds made it a journey of grinding effort. Kaiser would walk beside her, his body occasionally brushing against her leg, a silent, steadying presence. Back at the cabin, she didn't stack them outside. She brought them in. Her single room, already small, became a forest of drying cattails. They hung from the rafters, they were propped in corners, and they lay in careful rows on the floor. The air inside grew thick with the damp, earthy smell of the swamp, a scent that clung to her beige collared shirt, her dark brown vest, and her hair. She slept on a small cot, pushed into the one corner free of reeds, Kaiser a warm, solid weight on the floor beside her. At night, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, she would begin the weaving. She had built a simple, upright loom from scrap lumber, a crude but functional frame. The process was painfully slow. She would take the driest stalks and, using a simple over-under pattern, begin to create a dense, thick fabric. It was not a delicate art. It was brute force applied with patience. Her hands, already calloused from frontier life, began to blister and crack in the dry air of the cabin. She ignored the pain. She wove with a singular focus, her movements becoming automatic. Each finished mat was nearly 2 inches thick, surprisingly heavy, and possessed a strange, spongy resilience. It was a material that seemed to hold the memory of its own life. She was not just building a wall, she was creating a membrane. A skin. This knowledge had not come from a book on carpentry or a handy almanac. It came from a memory, sharp and clear as a shard of ice. Her husband, Robert, had not been a practical man. He had been a man of books, of theories, a man who had worked for a time as an assistant to an archaeologist who had traveled to Egypt. One winter night, not unlike the ones closing in on her now, he had been reading aloud from a brittle, leather-bound journal. She had been mending a shirt, only half listening, the warmth of their stove a comfort against the howling wind. He read a passage describing the dwellings of the ancient marsh dwellers along the Nile, people who built their homes from papyrus reeds. He had laughed at the time. They built floating islands and insulated their huts with mats woven thick as a man's fist, he'd quoted, a tone of academic amusement in his voice. The author claims the trapped air within the hollow reeds provided a barrier against the night's chill, more effective than mud or even thin stone. He had dismissed it as a curious anecdote, a piece of historical trivia. But Anna had not. She had heard the physics in the description. Trapped air. Not the material itself, but the space inside it. The principle had lodged in her mind, a seed planted in dormant soil, waiting for a season of desperate need. Robert was gone now, taken by a fever the previous spring, and all she had left of him were a few books and this one, peculiar memory. A memory she was now betting her life on. The first mat was finished after a week of relentless work. It was 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Hoisting it was a struggle. She dragged it outside and leaned it against the west-facing wall of her cabin, the one that took the brunt of the prevailing wind. It looked absurd. A patch of woven swamp grass against the sturdy, respectable timber of her home. It was this sight that greeted Frank Miller when he rode his buckboard past her property. Miller owned the general store and served as the town's primary distributor of news, opinion, and scorn. He pulled his horse to a halt, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly melted into derisive humor. He looked at the mat, then at Anna as she emerged from the cabin, her arms full of more reeds. He didn't even bother to greet her. He just laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried in the crisp air. He gestured toward the wall with his whip. "Planning for a flood, are we, Anna?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or are you building a nest? Maybe you think you can hatch yourself a new husband in there." A few men who were with him chuckled. Anna didn't reply. She didn't even look at him. She simply turned and began the laborious process of preparing the next batch of reeds for weaving. Her silence was more infuriating to Miller than any retort could have been. He flicked the reins. "Don't come to me for firewood when your bird's nest freezes solid," he shouted over his shoulder as the wagon rattled away. Stores closed to fools. A Kaiser, who had stood stiff-legged during the entire exchange, let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The first judgment had been passed. It would not be the last. The work continued, a silent rebuke to the town's collective wisdom. Day by day, the cabin disappeared. The west wall was the first to be fully sheathed in the thick, brown mats. Then the north. Anna developed a system, using rope and a simple pulley she rigged to a high branch of the lone pine tree that stood near her home. She would loop the ropes around a finished mat, haul it into a vertical position against the wall, and then, with painstaking effort, secure it to the cabin's exterior logs using long, hand-forged iron staples she'd hammered into the wood beforehand. The process was a study in leverage and exhaustion. Each mat weighed close to 50 pounds, and lifting it into place, keeping it flush against the wall while she hammered the securing ropes, was a battle. More than once, a mat slipped, crashing to the ground and forcing her to start over, her muscles screaming in protest. The cold was a constant adversary, seeping into her bones, making her fingers clumsy and her temper short. Yet she did not stop. She worked through the pain, through the fatigue, through the growing certainty in the town that she had lost her mind to grief. The children were the first to treat it as something other than madness. They would stop at the edge of her property on their way home from the one-room schoolhouse, their initial taunts, echoes of their parents' conversations, slowly dying out. They were replaced by a quiet curiosity. They watched her work, their faces betraying a fascination that the adults had long since suppressed. A small boy, no older than 7, once crept close while she was wrestling a mat into place. Kaiser watched him but did not move. The boy pointed a mittened hand. "Is it a blanket for your house?" he asked, his voice small. Anna paused, her breath coming in ragged clouds. She looked at the boy, then at the wall she was building. "Yes," she said, the single word a crackle in the frigid air. "Something like that." The boy nodded, as if this were the most logical explanation in the world. He then reached out and touched the surface of the woven reeds. His mitten sank slightly into the dense material. He pulled his hand back and looked at it, then ran off to join his friends, leaving Anna to her solitary labor. The children saw a blanket. The adults saw a fire trap. This concern brought the second visitor. Mr. Davies was the town's foremost builder, a man who spoke of timber with an almost religious reverence. He had built the church, the saloon, and most of the houses on Main Street. He arrived one afternoon, his posture as rigid as the new oak frame of the bank he was constructing. He walked around Anna's cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, his expression one of deep professional offense. He ran a hand over the log walls where they were still exposed, then tapped a knuckle against one of Anna's reed mats. It made a dull, unsatisfying thud. He finally stopped in front of her, his arms crossed. "Anna," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I knew your husband. He was a good man, if a bit theoretical. This, however, is an insult to good timber and sound engineering." He gestured at the wall. "What do you think this is going to accomplish? It's porous. It'll hold moisture, rot your logs, and become a haven for vermin. When the real cold hits, it will be nothing more than frozen straw." He wasn't mocking her, he was lecturing her, his authority rooted in years of stacking wood and driving nails. Anna finished hammering a staple into place before she turned to face him. She wiped a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "It's for the trapped air, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice even. "The reeds are hollow. Like a honeycomb. It's the air that does the work." Davies let out a short, sharp sigh of exasperation. "Eh? My girl, you need mass. You need thickness. You need seasoned, quarter-sawn oak with tight-packed chinking. That's what keeps the cold out. I have 2 cords of prime hardwood I can let you have on credit. Enough to see you through till March. Burn this nonsense before it brings your house down." He was offering her a lifeline, the conventional, accepted solution. He was offering her a place back in the fold of the sensible. Her refusal was quiet but absolute. "I have enough wood for my needs," she said, turning back to her work. "This will be enough." Davies stood there for a long moment, watching the methodical, seemingly pointless labor. He shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. "As you wish," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Don't say you weren't warned." He walked away, a man of solid matter leaving a world of flimsy theory behind. He had offered her facts. She had answered with faith in a dead man's words. The third and final official visit came from Marshal Brodie. He was a man who lived by the book, and the book, in this case, was a thin pamphlet of town ordinances. He arrived not with advice, but with authority. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Anna," he started, his tone polite but firm, "I've had a complaint. Several, in fact. Frank Miller and some others. They're concerned this constitutes a fire hazard." He unfolded the paper. "Ordinance 7. All structures must be maintained in a manner that does not present undue risk of fire to the structure itself or to neighboring properties." They're saying one stray spark from your chimney, and this whole thing goes up like a torch. He was not wrong. On the surface, she was wrapping her wooden house in kindling. Kaiser, sensing the official nature of the visit, remained by the door, silent but alert. Anna invited the marshal to see for himself. She led him to the wall and pulled back a corner of a mat that was not yet fully secured. "Touch the logs, Marshal," she said. He did, hesitantly. His glove came away damp. "The reeds are still curing," she explained. "They hold moisture from the marsh. They won't be dry enough to burn properly for months. And they're packed too tight. Fire needs air to breathe. There's no air between the fibers." She then led him inside. The interior was now almost entirely lined with hanging reeds, but in the center of the room, on a small table, was a ledger. The same kind Frank Miller used at the store. In it, in neat, precise columns, she had been keeping records. Dates, times, and 2 temperature readings. One from a thermometer hanging on the outside of the door, and one from a thermometer inside. "I've been tracking it," she said, pointing to the columns of numbers. "Even now, with the temperature dropping to 20 degrees at night, the inside of this room, without a fire in the stove, stays at 45. The reeds are already working." Brodie stared at the ledger. He was a man of law, but the law was built on evidence. Here was evidence. It was not evidence he understood, but it was meticulously recorded. He was accustomed to dealing with hysterics, with drunks, with disputes over property lines. He was not accustomed to a woman who met a legal challenge with scientific data. He looked from the neat columns of numbers to the woman standing before him. He saw no madness in her eyes. He saw an unnerving, unshakable certainty. He folded the ordnance and put it back in his pocket. "All right, Anna," he said slowly. "For now. But if that stove gets away from you, I'll have to enforce the ordinance." "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," she replied, and the simplicity of the statement left no room for argument. The marshal tipped his hat and left, a seed of doubt planted not in her methods, but in his own certainties. The cabin was finally encased. From the ground to the eaves, every square inch of log wall was hidden beneath the thick, woven skin. It had transformed the small, ordinary cabin into something strange and organic, a structure that seemed to have grown out of the earth itself. It was now early November. The sky had taken on a permanent, pearly grayness. The wind had a new edge to it, a razor-sharp bite that promised pain. The town of Providence hunkered down. Smoke plumed thick and constant from every chimney, a visible measure of the battle being waged within each home. Woodpiles, which had seemed immense in September, were now shrinking at an alarming rate. Inside those homes, the fight was constant. It was the endless stuffing of rags into window cracks, the laying of blankets against the bottoms of doors, the relentless, hungry feeding of the iron stoves that glowed red but seemed to push the cold back only a few feet. The cold was an intruder, a physical presence that found its way through the thickest logs and the most careful construction. It made metal untouchable, water a solid, and breath a cloud. Sarah was the last visitor before the world closed in. She was Anna's closest neighbor, another young woman whose husband was away on a cattle drive, not expected back until spring. She arrived in a flurry of snow, a shawl clutched tight around her face, carrying a small loaf of bread. She stepped inside Anna's cabin and stopped, her eyes wide. The air was not warm, but it was still. The oppressive, penetrating cold of the outside world was absent. It was like stepping from a storm into a cave. "Anna," she whispered, unwrapping the shawl. "The whole town is talking. They're scared for you." She placed the bread on the table, next to the ledger. Her own home, a cabin built by Mr. Davies himself, was a fortress of drafts. She and her two small children spent their days huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. "Frank Miller says you'll be frozen solid by Christmas. Mr. Davies says your logs will rot. Is it really going to work?" It was the question everyone was asking, but she was the only one to ask it with fear instead of scorn. She was the loyal doubter, the voice of shared vulnerability. Anna didn't offer theories or numbers. She simply gestured to the small, pot-bellied stove in the corner. It was cold and dark. Beside it, her woodpile was modest, barely a quarter of a cord. "I haven't lit a fire in 3 days, Sarah," Anna said. Sarah stared at the stove, then looked around the room. It was at least 40 degrees inside. Her own cabin, with a fire blazing, was barely warmer. She touched the interior log wall. It was cool, but it did not have the bone-deep iciness of her own walls. She looked at Anna, at her calm, steady expression, and for the first time, she felt a flicker not of pity, but of a strange and unsettling hope. "My God, Anna," she said, her voice barely audible. The unspoken half of the sentence hung in the air between them. "What have the rest of us done?" The snapper did not arrive, it materialized. One afternoon, the grey sky began to descend, the clouds thickening and sinking until they seemed to merge with the horizon. The wind died completely, creating a silence that was more terrifying than any howl. The temperature, which had been hovering in the low teens, began to plummet. November 21st, 1887, 12 degrees, the on-screen text of history was being written. By nightfall, it was 0. The first fine, hard grains of snow began to fall, not drifting, but driving down as if propelled from a shotgun. By morning, the world was gone, erased by a maelstrom of white. November 22nd, -15 degrees. Providence ceased to be a town of individual houses and became a collection of isolated, desperate islands in a sea of frozen fury. The wind screamed, a high, keening sound that seemed to be stripping the very air of its warmth. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, burying fences, then windows, then entire porches. Travel was impossible. To step outside was to die. Inside the conventionally built homes, life became a singular, primal struggle. In Frank Miller's house, the largest in town, the windows were opaque with a thick layer of frost on the inside. His wife and children were huddled in the kitchen, the only room they now occupied, wrapped in blankets and coats. They had burned through a week's worth of wood in a single day. The cold was a predator. It found every crack in the floorboards, every gap in the chinking. The sound of the house groaning under the assault of the wind and cold was the sound of a ship breaking apart. Miller, the man of loud certainties, was now a man of silent fear, feeding his stove with a desperation that bordered on panic. In Mr. Davies's own home, the one he'd built as a showpiece of his craft, a more subtle failure was occurring. The extreme cold was making the seasoned timber contract. Microscopic gaps, invisible in normal weather, were opening up all over the structure, creating 100 tiny new pathways for the cold to invade. His fortress of wood was betraying him. He sat in his chair, listening to the house settle and pop, each sound a testament to his own short-sightedness. He had built for strength. He had not built for this. In Anna's cabin, there was no battle. The outside world ceased to exist. The screaming of the wind was muffled to a low, distant moan, as if it were happening in another country. The snow that piled against the reed-covered walls was not an enemy, it was an ally. It filled the gaps in the weave, sealing the outer layer and adding its own considerable insulating properties. The cabin was now encased in a shell of woven reeds, ice, and several feet of snow. It was a giant igloo with a wooden core. Inside, the stillness was absolute. Anna lit the stove, but she did not feed it with frantic urgency. A few small logs, just enough to bring the temperature up, were all that was needed. The heat, once generated, did not immediately flee through the walls and ceiling. It stayed. The ledger on her table told the story. Outside temperature, an estimated -25 degrees. Inside temperature, 3 feet from the stove, 60 degrees. The interior log walls, the ones that in any other cabin would be coated in ice, were cool and dry to the touch. Kaiser was not curled into a tight, shivering ball. He was sprawled on the floor, asleep, his body relaxed. The proof was in the small things. A glass of water on the table did not freeze. The bread Sarah had brought remained soft. Anna moved about the cabin wearing her vest, but no heavy coat. She spent her time oiling her leather tools, reading one of Robert's books, and listening. She was listening to the silence. It was the sound of a theory becoming a fact. It was the sound of survival. During a brief, merciful lull in the storm on the third day, a sound came from the door. A frantic, desperate pounding. Anna, with Kaiser at her side, unbarred the door. A figure, caked in snow, stumbled inside and collapsed on the floor. It was the town doctor, a man named Albright. He had been trying to get to the Miller house, where one of the children had a severe croup. His own home had become uninhabitable, the fire in his stove unable to compete with the cold. He had set out, thinking he could make it, and had become disoriented in the whiteout. He had stumbled upon Anna's strange, mound-like cabin by sheer luck. Dr. Albright was a man of science, of observable phenomena. And the first thing he observed was that he was no longer in danger of freezing to death. He pushed himself to a sitting position, his body racked with shivering. But as the moments passed, the shivering began to subside. He slowly, painfully, pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white, on the verge of frostbite. He looked around the room, his gaze taking in the calm, the quiet, the unbelievable absence of biting cold. He saw the gently glowing stove, the small, tidy woodpile. He saw Anna, watching him with a calm that seemed otherworldly. He saw the dog, who had merely watched his entrance without aggression. His doctor's mind, trained to assess and diagnose, was working furiously. He had left a world of -30 degrees and killing wind. He had entered a space that felt like a spring cellar. How he managed to choke out, his throat raw. Anna didn't answer with words. She walked to the wall and patted the smooth, cool logs. Then she pointed to the ledger. The doctor, a man who trusted charts and data above all else, crawled over to the table. He stared at the columns of numbers. Outside. Inside. The differential. It was impossible. It defied the known laws of thermodynamics as he understood them. But the numbers were there. And the warmth, or rather the lack of cold, was undeniable. He looked up at Anna, his expression one of dawning, horrified respect. He had come to check on the mad widow. He had found the only sane person in town. The snapper held the territory in its grip for 6 days. When the sky finally cleared, it revealed a world remade in ice. The sun shone on a landscape of brutal, glittering beauty. But in the town of Providence, there was no beauty, only a reckoning. The cost was staggering. Dozens of cattle, frozen solid in the fields. Half the town's winter stores of food ruined in frozen cellars. And the human cost, 2 prospectors found dead in their shack, and a dozen cases of severe frostbite, some of which would lead to amputations. The town was a landscape of suffering. The smoke that now rose from the chimneys was thick with a new kind of fuel, furniture. Chairs, tables, dressers, anything that would burn was being fed into the stoves. The sound of saws cutting apart bedsteads was the new town anthem. The first pilgrim to Anna's door was Frank Miller. He didn't knock. He simply appeared, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and fear. His bravado was gone, stripped away by the cold as surely as the bark had been stripped from the wood he was now burning. His youngest daughter was sick, her breathing a ragged, rattling sound in the icy air of their home. Dr. Albright, now recovered and staying with Anna, had told him the child needed to be in a warm, stable environment or she would not survive the night. Miller stood at the threshold of Anna's cabin, a bundle of blankets in his arms. Inside the bundle was his daughter. He looked at Anna, and for a moment, the old scorn flickered in his eyes, a last ember of his pride. But it was quickly extinguished by the overwhelming desperation. He didn't apologize. He wouldn't. But his question was a confession of utter defeat. The doctor said, he began, his voice cracking. He said it was warm here and Anna just stepped aside, holding the door open. Miller entered the small cabin, the change in temperature so profound it was like stepping into another season. He looked around the room, at the doctor tending to a pot on the stove, at the impossible comfort of it all. He unwrapped his daughter, and her shivering, which had been constant for 2 days, began to ease almost immediately. He sank onto a stool, the weight of his own folly crushing him. He looked at the woven walls of his own making, the scorn he had heaped upon this woman, and then at the strange, swamp-reed skin of her cabin. He didn't ask how. He knew he had no right. He just sat there, a broken man in a warm room, saved by the very thing he had mocked. Mr. Davies came next. He did not come for warmth. He came for answers. He arrived with a hammer and a crowbar, a look of grim determination on his face. He walked to the north wall of the cabin, where the snow had been scoured away by the wind, exposing the frozen reed mat. He expected to find the reed shattered and brittle, a useless husk of ice. He swung the hammer. Instead of the sharp crack of ice, there was a dull, rubbery thud. The hammer bounced back. The reeds, encased in and filled with ice, had become a composite material, something akin to reinforced concrete. He used the crowbar, trying to pry a section away from the wall. He strained, the muscles in his back cording, but the mat held fast, frozen to the logs. Finally, he gave up. He walked to the front of the cabin, where Anna was splitting a small log for the stove. Her woodpile was still larger than his. He looked at her small pile of split wood, then at the thin, lazy wisp of smoke rising from her chimney. He thought of his own voracious stove, of the mountain of wood he had burned, of the precious furniture he had sacrificed. He looked at her, the builder looking at the architect of his undoing. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a single, sharp dip of his head. It was a gesture of surrender, a master craftsman acknowledging a superior principle. He had built with solid mass. She had built with intelligent space. He had lost. The reversal was quiet, but it was total. Anna's cabin became the town's infirmary, its sanctuary. Sarah brought her children and moved in, helping Anna tend to the sick. Marshal Brody, conducting his wellness checks, found misery in every home but one. He would stand in Anna's doorway, look at the recovering children, the stable warmth, and then at the ledger on the table, which Anna still updated religiously. The numbers were the final, irrefutable truth. They were the story of the storm, told not in words of suffering, but in degrees of temperature. The mockers had become the supplicants. The fool on the hill had become the keeper of the fire. They didn't praise her. They didn't thank her in any grand fashion. Their presence was thanks enough. They brought what little they had, a sack of flour, a few preserved vegetables, a handful of bullets. They came to her not as a hero, but as a utility, a resource as vital as a well or a woodlot. And Anna, in her quiet, practical way, accepted it all without comment or triumph. She had not done it for them. She had done it for herself, to survive. Their salvation was merely a byproduct of her own. Spring came late that year, a slow, grudging thaw that revealed the full extent of the damage the snapper had wrought. As the mounds of snow melted, they uncovered a landscape of death and decay. But at Anna's cabin, the melting snow revealed something else. The reed mats, stained and weathered, were largely intact. They sagged away from the walls, heavy with meltwater, their job completed. One morning, as Anna began the laborious process of cutting them down, she found she was not alone. Mr. Davies was there. He wasn't holding a hammer. He was just watching. He watched her slice through the ropes and let a heavy section of the mat fall to the muddy ground. He walked over and knelt beside it. He picked at the weave, separating the reeds, looking at how they were layered, how they were joined. He saw the genius in its simplicity, the elegance in its function. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at the pile of salvaged mats, then at Anna. The sun was on her face, and in its light, she no longer looked like a grieving widow, but like someone who had faced down the end of the world and was unimpressed. Next autumn, Mr. Davies said, his voice quiet but clear. Before the cold comes, will you show me how you weave them? It was not a question. It was the closing of a circle. The expert had come to the amateur. The man of wood had come to learn from the woman of reeds. The old knowledge, dismissed and forgotten, was about to be remembered. Not in a book, not as a theory, but in the calloused, capable hands of a community that had finally learned what it meant to be truly prepared. When the world tells you there is only one way to build a wall against the cold, and the experts all agree, and the crowd laughs at any other method, where do you place your faith? In the strength of the material you can see, or in the power of the space you cannot?